Everyone remembers the plane crash in 1977 that took Ronnie Van Zant, but almost no one knows the band had already cheated death many times before that day. Bullets, lightning and sickness all tried to take them. Fate had been trying to kill them long before the plane ever fell from the sky. Lynyrd Skynyrd stands as the undisputed titan of Southern rock, their legacy forever etched in the American consciousness by the catastrophic plane crash of 1977 that claimed 3 members in a single brutal instant. Across the same turbulent era, Aerosmith clawed their way through 5 decades of excess, surviving addiction, infighting, and countless close calls without ever losing a single member to tragedy. How do we reconcile this stark imbalance, where one band endured a collective curse and the other seemed blessed with an almost unbreakable resilience? The answer, as with most legends, lies not in the final catastrophe, but in the harrowing sequence of near-death experiences that preceded it, a pattern of fate sharpening its blade long before the engines ever failed. Was it sheer luck, a cosmic oversight, or something far darker that allowed these men to walk away from bullets, lightning and drowning, only to be claimed by the sky? To understand the full weight of the tragedy that would define them, we must first examine the chilling ledger of their survival, a list of miracles that ultimately made their demise feel less like an accident and more like an inevitability. In 1976, at a hotel in Jacksonville, Florida, the night after a show, Ronnie Van Zant found himself in a violent argument with an aggressive fan. The confrontation escalated into gunfire, and a bullet slammed into the singer's chest. It was a moment that should have ended his life, but fate had other plans. The round ricocheted off his rib, leaving a long scar but missing every vital organ, and mismeasured in mere centimetres. The police report noted the bullet had lodged in the wall just 10 centimetres from his head, meaning a slight shift in his posture would have been fatal. In the chaos, as an ambulance got stuck in traffic, a quick-thinking lighting technician named Jimmy Hall rushed Ronnie to the hospital in the tour truck, a desperate act that prevented him from bleeding out. He survived, but the scar stayed with him as a permanent reminder of how thin the line was between living and dying. Was this the universe testing them, or just the first cruel warning of what was still to come? That night in Jacksonville was the first time Lynyrd Skynyrd cheated death, but it would not be the last. October 19, 1974. The South Carolina State Fair in Columbia, a sprawling sea of carnival lights and fried food haze, was supposed to be just another stop on the relentless circuit. But as Lynyrd Skynyrd took the stage, the sky above the fairgrounds had already turned a bruised, violent shade of green. A massive thunderstorm was rolling in, and the air itself felt charged, thick with an energy that made the hair on your arms stand up. The band launched into their set, the roar of the guitars competing with the low growl of the approaching tempest. Then, in a blinding flash that seared itself into the memory of everyone present, a bolt of lightning struck the towering sound rig directly. The electricity didn't just hit the metal. It coursed down the cables, surging through the microphones like a living thing. Drummer Bob Burns took the full force of the jolt, his body locking up as the current ripped through him, leaving him paralysed and crumpled behind his kit for a terrifying 15 minutes. The entire stage lighting system fried in an instant, plunging the massive crowd of over 10,000 into darkness punctuated only by panic. Yet, in a moment of pure defiant rock and roll instinct, the band grabbed flashlights, propped them on their amps, and played on for the stunned audience. They had just stared down nature's raw fury and walked away. It was another narrow escape, another notch on a tally that was growing with alarming speed. But was this sheer bad luck, or was the universe sending them a warning? By August of 1977, the band had grown accustomed to cheating death, though they could not have known the pattern was about to tighten around them like a noose. They rented a boat on the St. Johns River in Florida, a broad, slow-moving waterway that seemed harmless enough for an afternoon of escape from the road. The vessel was not built for sudden violence, but the river had other plans when a wall of water rose without warning and flipped the craft mid-current. All 4 core members were thrown into the churning brown, their boots and denim dragging them toward the bottom. What chance did a musician have against a river that had already swallowed ships whole? A group of local fishermen, working the banks as they had for decades, pulled them from the water one by one, their arms burning with the effort of saving men who had nearly become ghosts. The national press never ran a word about it. No headline screamed about a band that almost vanished before its time. 2 months later, They would board a Convair 240 and the world would finally take notice, but only after the sky itself turned against them. Fate had tried the water just as it had tried fire and lead, and only now did it reach for the clouds. Billy Powell, the keyboardist whose piano lines gave the band its signature soul, nearly died in 1975 when years of heavy drinking culminated in a sudden attack of acute pancreatitis that landed him in the emergency room, his body finally rebelling against the abuse it had silently endured for so long. Just 2 years before the plane went down, his organs were already staging a revolt, a brutal warning that went unheeded by a band too deep in the throes of its own success to listen. Then there was the London tour in June of that same year, a trip that was supposed to cement their international status, but instead saw Ronnie Van Zant collapse mid-performance on stage, his body giving out after 3 consecutive nights of relentless drinking. The band's own tour doctor rushed to his side and delivered a chilling diagnosis: acute adrenal insufficiency, a severe medical emergency that signaled his body was shutting down from sheer exhaustion. Who survives a gunshot, lightning and drowning only to have their own lifestyle slowly dismantle them from the inside? The root of this self-destruction could be traced directly to a contract signed in 1973, when the band fell under the management of Peter Rudge, the man who had run tours for the Rolling Stones, a hire that brought prestige but also introduced a culture of excess they had never known before. Under his guidance, the first tour became a masterclass in indulgence, planting the seeds for a host of serious health conditions that would plague them for years. The numbers from their own tour manager, Dean Kilpatrick, paint a stark picture of the reality on the road, recording that each member consumed roughly 2 bottles of whiskey a day during the 1976-1977 tours, a staggering amount that makes the medical emergencies not a question of if, but when. It becomes painfully clear why pancreatitis, fatty liver disease and exhaustion were constant companions. Their bodies were never given a chance to recover, pushed relentlessly until they simply broke down. What does it say about a life when the liver gives out before the plane does? By the time the wheels left the ground on that fateful October day, their bodies were already dying in slow motion, the engines of their own demise running long before the Convair ever took off. By 1972, they were riding the first wave of their debut album's success when their entire rig met a wall of flame at a Mississippi gas station. The truck hauling every amp and speaker they owned caught fire, turning roughly $60,000 worth of gear into scrap metal. No one was hurt, but the band spent the next week performing on borrowed instruments, a humbling reset for a group suddenly tasting momentum. How many more warnings would the road have to deliver before they listened? Then came the summer of 1975, when they traded the cramped Learjet for something far more grounded, a luxury touring bus that manager Dean Kilpatrick had outfitted himself. They christened it the Freebird Express, a rolling monument to their own mythology, and took it straight into a ditch on Interstate 10 near Baton Rouge. The crash sent 2 sound technicians to the hospital with serious injuries, leaving the band to stare at the twisted wreckage and wonder if the machine itself was cursed. They climbed onto the replacement bus anyway, laughing off the bruises as the cost of doing business. Perhaps the most absurd near-miss belonged to drummer Bob Burns, who in 1973 almost became a headline for all the wrong reasons at a Dallas show. A frayed microphone cable sent a live current surging through him mid-performance, and for 2 terrifying weeks his hands were too unsteady to hold a pair of sticks. He survived, recovered, and later quit the band in 1974, escaping a fate his former bandmates were still hurtling toward. The pattern was undeniable, yet no one seemed to notice that death kept circling with an almost theatrical patience. What do you call a band that survives fire, crashes, and electric shock in the span of 3 years? Reckless, maybe. Or perhaps simply a band that believed its own legend absolutely. Each escape only hardened their conviction that they were untouchable, that the universe had stamped them with an invisible seal of invincibility. By the time 1977 rolled around, they had danced with disaster so many times that the danger had become background noise, just another instrument in the mix. They had no way of knowing that the road was simply lining up its final, most spectacular move. On October 20, 1977, the quiet countryside near Galesburg, Mississippi, became the stage for a tragedy that would forever seal the fate of Lynyrd Skynyrd. The Convair CV-240, a chartered plane carrying the band and their crew, fell from the sky in a pine forest, ending 6 lives in an instant. Among the dead were the band's founder Ronnie Van Zant, guitarist Steve Gaines, and his sister, backing vocalist Cassie Gaines, along with 3 others who shared their final flight. The silence that followed was broken only by the rain and the desperate sounds of survival. Survivor Ken Peden, the band's sound technician, would later recall the precise moment the right engine failed, describing the sound as crackling like fireworks at exactly 6:42 in the evening. That auditory memory, confirmed by investigators against the plane's own clock, marks the instant when everything changed forever. In that terrible moment, the machine that was supposed to carry them to their next show became their tomb, and the world lost a voice that had defined Southern rock. Amid the twisted metal and the moans of the injured, one figure moved with grim determination. Drummer Artemis Pyle, suffering from broken ribs and internal bleeding, clawed his way out of the wreckage and set off on a desperate mission. He ran roughly a mile through the dark, rain-soaked pine woods, every step sending agony through his shattered body, until he finally reached the home of a local farmer named Lacey Kaiser. It was Kaiser who took the bloodied musician in, made the call for ambulances, and became the first link in a chain of rescue that saved the lives of the other survivors. The scale of the disaster was staggering, with debris from the aircraft scattered across an area of about 400 square meters, a grim testament to the force of the impact. The recovery effort, hampered by relentless rain and the swampy terrain of Amite County, took a grueling 48 hours to remove the wreckage, forcing rescue workers to use small boats just to reach parts of the scene. A simple wooden memorial now stands near Highway 57, southwest of Gillsburg, where fans still leave flowers every October 20th, a quiet ritual for a band that never made it home. The captain of that final flight was Walter McCreary, a pilot who logged roughly 7,500 total flying hours, yet fewer than 200 of them were on the Convair 240. It is a discrepancy the National Transportation Safety Board flagged as a critical deficiency in his transition training for that specific aircraft type. But the more immediate problem was simpler and more unforgiving. The right engine had run out of fuel. Investigators later determined the crew had a narrow window to avert the catastrophe, a chance that vanished because they never checked the fuel gauge in those final 15 minutes. An inoperative warning system meant no alarm ever sounded to alert them. The band had been flying 4 consecutive days, with 6 domestic hops packed into the previous 48 hours, and the cockpit crew had managed only 4 hours of rest the night before. What was the exact moment exhaustion finally overrode procedure? There was no single fatal error, just a chain of small, avoidable miscalculations that stacked into an irreversible disaster. In August 1977, mere weeks before their final flight, Lynyrd Skynyrd had signed the biggest record deal of their career, a $20 million contract with MCA Records. That agreement, hailed as a crowning achievement, was rendered void the moment the plane went down, leaving nothing but legal echoes for the families left behind. Those families, already shattered by grief, received only a fifth of the insurance money that was rightfully due to them, a cruel financial blow layered upon an emotional one. A 1985 study by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which examined the loss of breadwinners in the entertainment industry, found that these families received less than 30% of their expected insurance payouts. That figure stands in stark contrast to the 72% average for other workplace fatalities, a disparity rooted in a highly contested clause known as death while performing, a legal trap buried deep within the band's contracts. How does a tragedy of this scale, so obviously not an act of performance, become a reason to withhold compensation? The entire ordeal highlighted how the business side of music could be as unforgiving as the road itself, with legal fine print dictating the value of a human life long after the music stopped. But out of this dark chapter came a single tangible change that would outlast all the legal battles. Because the crash was so difficult to categorize, the Federal Aviation Administration, in 1978, mandated that all commercial private aircraft with 15 or more seats be equipped with cockpit voice recorders, the black boxes that are now standard. It's a grim irony that the band's horrific end finally forced the industry to prioritize the safety of those who fly, a legacy written not in contracts but in regulations. The sky that took them, in the end, forced a change that would protect countless others. Artemis Pyle carried more than broken ribs out of that Mississippi swamp. He carried the image of Ronnie Van Zant's final moments burned into his mind, a ghost that would not loosen its grip. For a decade he wrestled with post-traumatic stress in silence, the weight of that night pressing down, until he finally broke his silence on National Public Radio in 1980, becoming the only survivor to publicly reconstruct the horror for listeners across America. Alan Collins, the guitarist who had helped build the band's signature twin guitar attack, seemed to escape the curse only to be hunted down by it years later. In 1986, a drunk driving crash claimed the life of his girlfriend and earned him a 6-month prison sentence. By 1990, at just 37 years old, pneumonia finished what the bottle had started. A slow-motion tragedy that made the plane crash look almost merciful by comparison. Gary Rossington, the last original member standing, chose defiance over despair, strapping on his guitar night after night for 46 years after the wreck, though a stroke in 2015 forced him to cancel 15 tribute shows before he finally surrendered in 2023 at 71. Bob Burns, who had fled the band in 1974 citing crippling anxiety, became the only original member to slip the noose entirely, dying peacefully of pneumonia in 2015, untouched by the fire that consumed his former bandmates. And Leon Wilkeson lay pinned beneath the mangled fuselage for 4 hours in the rain, both legs shattered, listening to his friends cry out for help he could not bring them, a sound he would later describe with a hollow distance in his voice that suggested the real damage was never in the bones at all. Each survivor walked away carrying a different wound, some visible, most not, but all of them forever marked by a single night in October that refused to stay buried. A 2019 Harvard study on our cultural obsession with bands lost to aviation disasters placed Lynyrd Skynyrd among the 5 most powerful living legends in 20th century American rock, standing alongside the deaths of Elvis Presley and John Lennon. Vanderbilt University researchers found in 2011 that public discourse mentioned the Skynyrd crash over 40% more often than Elvis's death in the same decade. Yet academic coverage lagged so far behind that popular journalism had to fill the void. The deepest layer of this mythos, however, was not manufactured by scholars or reporters, but spoken by the man himself. In a 1974 interview with Hit Parada, Ronnie Van Zant repeatedly told his bandmates, "We won't live to see 30. And when he died on October 20, 1977, he was 29 years old, exactly 23 days shy of his 30th birthday. The prophecy he whispered into the ears of his closest friends had come true with a precision that still chills anyone who hears it, and his daughter Melody, only 2 years old at the time of the crash, later revealed in the 2018 documentary If I Leave Here Tomorrow that her father left behind a letter with instructions on choosing a life partner, evidence that he carried a premonition of his own end. His words were not a fleeting remark, but a conviction he repeated often enough that those around him never forgot the exact phrasing, and when the plane fell from the sky, the eerie accuracy of his foresight became part of the band's enduring mystique. Yet the legend was not built on tragedy alone, because the loyalty of their audience turned grief into an eternal flame. Billboard's 2017 analysis showed that the various reunion lineups had generated over $300 million in global touring revenue by 2020, a figure that speaks to a devotion far beyond the average nostalgia act. The Rock and Roll Research Institute's 2020 report documented the grim statistics behind this devotion, noting that 9 of the band's 16 members had died, a mortality rate of 56.25%. The highest among the 30 biggest American rock bands, with every single loss occurring before the age of 75. So the question lingers, what keeps a band alive when more than half its members are gone? The answer rests not in the bodies that perished, but in the story that survived. Because every time a fan plays Freebird at a summer bonfire or lays flowers at the wooden memorial in Gillsburg, the flames of that legend are fed by hands that never knew the original lineup. The Harvard study called it a cultural obsession. The Vanderbilt report called it a media gap, but to the millions who still sing along, it is simply the unbreakable bond between a band that refused to die and an audience that refused to forget. To examine a prophecy like Ronnie's requires a steady hand, and researchers at Yale suggest 4 careful steps. Gather at least 3 recorded or officially interviewed statements of the prophecy, rather than relying on second-hand retellings. Determine whether the public heard the words before or only after the event unfolded. Compare the timing of the statement against the moment of its fulfillment, and finally place the words within their cultural context so no one mistakes poetic intuition for literal fate. When those steps are applied to Ronnie Van Zant's prediction, the result is not superstition, but a haunting clarity that elevates his band from musicians to myth. Their music outlived their bodies, Their words outlived their breath, and their story now belongs to everyone who ever wondered what it means to stare down death and keep playing anyway. Some fates do not just arrive, they circle. For Lynyrd Skynyrd, destiny was not a single blow but a long grinding campaign of bullets, storms, sickness and wreckage, each one a near miss that somehow left them standing. Yet when the music finally stopped on that October evening, it was not because the band had been defeated, but because their story had been sealed into permanence. Think of the odds they had already cheated: a gunshot that grazed a rib, lightning that froze a drummer mid-beat, a river that almost swallowed them whole, all before the age of 30 had even caught up to their youngest member. Those who loved them learned that survival was never guaranteed, only borrowed, and that made every note they played feel like a gift held against the dark. The crash itself was brutal beyond measure, with only 3 of the 26 aboard walking away, without the need for long hospitalization, while 20 others were left to mend broken spines and shattered minds, as recorded in the files of Macomb Memorial Hospital. But even in that devastation, little Lynyrd Van Zant, just 2 years old back in Jacksonville, would later speak in the documentary, "If I leave here tomorrow," of a father who seemed to sense the end, leaving a letter with instructions on how she should choose a partner, a quiet act of love that turned prophecy into tenderness. So when you ask why we still remember them, look past the tragedy and see the defiance. They were not just musicians who died, but men who refused to vanish, their songs outlasting every force that tried to erase them. The plane crash, everyone knows, was only the final chapter in a story that began long before, and the reason we still sing along is that their spirit never learned how to fall. Which band, against all odds, makes you believe in survival? Share your story below, and stay with us for more chapters from the history of rock.